why I'm here is to talk about why did the slaves follow the North Star. So we hear about slavery happening in America. We hear about black people being taken from Africa and brought across the Atlantic Ocean and subjugated in the Americas. And this is the last place that those people from Africa stayed. And then after slavery, they were so-called emancipated, and slavery's over. And we celebrate that slavery's been abolished every year. Right? During slavery, African Americans were not even allowed to worship as westernized Christians. Later during Reconstruction, the myth of the majority of free Africans were devout Christians was merely a political ploy deliberately disseminated in popular media by white abolitionists and black preachers as an argument against slavery in their naive attempt to present the enslaved masses as civilized and therefore human. And that's from a book called Vodun by Mama Zobe. Now the next quote is from a book called Bound for Canaan. So the book's called Bound for Canaan, and it's about slaves that escaped to Canada. Right? For many of the thousands of blacks who escaped slavery in the 19th century America through the network of the Underground Railroad, Canaan meant Canada and freedom. In Bound for Canaan, the first panoramic exploration of the Underground Railroad, slaves, slave owners, and emancipators are caught up in a fierce clash of values that becomes a turning point in race relations and human rights movement. And the human rights movement. So, Noah said, curse Canaan. Right? Blessed be the God of Shem, but Canaan shall be his slave. God prosper Japheth, but Canaan shall be his slave. So if the slaves were so-called indoctrinated through Christianity, and they supposedly, beat to death with the Bible, then why would they escape to Canaan knowing that it's cursed? That name is cursed. That race of people is cursed. Anything related to Canaan is cursed. And based on the practices that we hear the slaves tried to keep, we know that there were practices that were based on our culture, right? It was things that we did naturally. So they didn't really steal anything or stop us from not doing our culture. We stopped doing it. And when we accept responsibility, then we can start moving forward. Just like we have to accept the responsibility that, yeah, we enslaved our own people. But we also enslaved the Europeans. Right? For years, we have heard about slaves escaping to Canaanland, but never really considered why. These are so-called slaves from Africa that are escaping slavery, but they're going to a place called Canaan to do it, which is supposedly a cursed place from their doctrinized Christian perspective, considering that that's what they went through during slavery. Right? How did the so-called slaves escape the south to the north using the North Star if they had so-called lost their culture during slavery in America? So to even have the thought of the North Star in your mind, you have to have some type of degree of knowledge of astrology and cosmology. You're not just going to know that that's the North Star. That's not just going to be something that's common knowledge to a so-called slave that was indoctrinated, can't read, can't write, a lot of them are illiterate, but they know about the North Star. Right? Frederick Douglass revealed to his readers that some songs interpreted by outsiders as referring to life after death in heaven were actually understood within the enslaved African community as signifying a determination to reach freedom in the North, outside the reach and power of the Southern plantation owners. So it's Frederick Douglass, right, that history books, you know, black, whatever, helping the Africans and all of that, telling the people in his own words that just like Alim Bey taught when he first came here, that the Bible is allegory. And if these so-called people that came out of slavery were so-called beaten the head, not to know their culture and not to know themselves, how does he know about allegory in the Bible? To make reference to the fact that when we're talking about life and death and heaven in the Bible, in hymns, we're not talking about life and death. We're talking about escaping hell, which is slavery, and getting into the light, which is in the north. And the light is freedom. You have a comment about it, Mufti?
Oh, just saying, want the lights off?
Everybody sees it, right?
They put down the screen.
A little bit. And Karen, could you get some of these? Just here.
That better?
Yeah, much better.
Yeah.
All right. Now keep in mind, with regard to Frederick Douglass, right, that the Douglasses were once the most powerful family in Scotland. From Ancient and Modern Britain, chapter 5, David McRitchie. And it was that date, and it was at that date that the Moors, or Douglasses, or Picts of Galloway, fell from their high estate into the position of outlawed and landless marauders. And Douglas comes from that underlined word there, Douglas. And you can also find that in Othello's Children in the New World by Jose Pimenta Bay. Coded communication. So there's some slaves, remember, right? They have no knowledge, they're illiterate. They came off slave ships from Africa, and then they came here. And they were subjugated here, and they lost their culture, and they lost their memory, and they don't know who they are. And you know what I mean? They're walking around right now, patting off their ass, don't know nothing. Right? Perhaps the best known of the spirituals in service of freedom during the subjugated Moorish period in America was the embedding of hidden or coded messages in hymn lyrics. Items were also used to carry coded messages, like coded quilts, for the purpose of clandestine secret communication on the Underground Railroad. Same thing that Frederick Douglass is saying. Right? Everybody knows the word occult means hidden, so if these messages in the hymn lyrics were coded, that means they were hidden. That means that the slaves were dealing with some occult. They weren't just slaves from Africa. Because if they were illiterate, what do they know about occult and those type of sciences, cosmological, astrological sciences? Like, how do they know that if they're so-called slaves that lost their culture, came over here on a slave ship? Astronomy, the study and observation of celestial bodies. Astrology studies their influence on primarily human behavior and nature. And cosmology is the branch of metaphysics that deals with the foundation and the origin of all these things, as far as the cosmos are concerned. Free will astrology is one of the most important aspects of astrological studies. Astrology does predict our future. At the time of our birth, certain planetary movements related to our zodiac signs are active, and they greatly influence the course of our life. Yet we must remember at the same time that each human being is born with a gift of free will to act despite the fate lines on his palms at the time of his birth. So we have the power within us to activate ourselves in certain ways. There's certain things that we can do that allows us to activate these dormant properties of ourselves that are told to don't exist anymore. Or we can't do that because there's too much cell phones and too much computers and radiation everywhere. We can't do this or that. Right? Keep in mind also, free will astrology is the undertone of the whole birth certificate fraud. Because for you to have a birth certificate, you have to give up the birth record. And the birth record is what has all the information that they're talking about when they say astrology does predict the future. At the time of our birth, certain planetary movements related to our zodiac signs are active, and they greatly influence the course of our life. Them knowing when you were born, what time you were born, where you were born, all plays in line with that. Right? So the idea is to digest the perspective that the slaves that were getting out of slavery were moving on. And they weren't some slaves. These were high scientists. These were shamans. These were metaphysicians. This is why during the same time, and we talk about this during class, during the same time of subjugation, when people are getting lynched and you know there's no rights for black people and all that, you have certain black people that's inventing stuff. Same time. And those guys aren't getting lynched. And nobody's bothering them, and nobody's trying to do anything to those people. So there's our black history in America is tainted. And we need to correct that part so we can move forward. But the only reason we're not showing any progress is because we keep dibbling and dabbling in this slave history. It has nothing to do with us. It's called black history. Just like the dark ages of Europe are called dark ages, and it has nothing to do with dark-skinned people. So why would we think that black history has something to do with us? When dark and black are relative. And during the time called dark ages, the people who are considered black people today were actually uplifting the people that were in the dark ages. They weren't the slaves. The other people were the slaves during the dark ages. The people that we would call the white people were the slaves during the dark ages. But then in black history, the roles switched. And then we bought that and started running off with that information. So the most well-known of all railroad conductors is Harriet Tubman. Now, they say that Harriet Tubman was born into slavery on Maryland's eastern shore. Harriet's ancestors had been brought to America in shackles from Africa. At 13, while defending a fellow slave who tried to run away, her overseer struck her in the head with a 2-pound weight. This resulted in recurring narcoleptic seizures or sleeping spells that plagued her the rest of her life.